variables on a TI84. Let's take a look at how we can analyze the variables. We're going to look at variables the vehicle weight and the miles per gallon of the variables we're going to look at are cars. The vehicle weight and the miles per gallon. We'd like to create a scatter diagram 5 different cars and calculate the correlation coefficient. We'd like to create a scatter diagram. And to do that, the easiest way to do that on a TI84 or a TI83 do that the easiest way regression analysis on a TI84 or a TI83 is by we can go to the stat key to enter the values into the list. So we can choose enter and enter the values into the list. So we can choose edit to create a scatter. The values there. To create a scatter diagram, I'd like to go to the stat plot menu. So I'm going to hit second and then the y equals key to go over to the stat plot menu, and I want to choose one of the plots. So I'll press enter. I can press enter to turn it on, to make it active, and then hit the down arrow to choose the type of graph, and the type that we want, the scatter diagram, is the very first graph that we see there, so press enter to choose that. And then the data we entered was in list 1 and list 2, which are the default settings. If your data was somewhere else, you would want to identify the lists that the data is in. And we could choose a couple different marks. So if you were making more than one scatter diagram, you'd want to choose a different mark for each one. To actually complete the process, let me go up here and I want to choose zoom and then choose option 9, which is the stat zoom. So we can go down to that. If you're not familiar with that, to see it, and hit enter, or I could just press the number 9. And that'll set up the window so that it displays all 5 data points. So it chooses minimum and maximum values so that it can display all the data points. And notice that the weight is on the x-axis and the miles per gallon is on the y-axis. Trace allows us to go from one point to another. Hitting the right or left arrow will move us between the different points, and so we can see their values. So that's the scatter diagram. An important value, the correlation coefficient, in particular when data is like this, when data seems to have kind of a linear trend, so there seems to be sort of a line that the data follows, the correlation coefficient can help us measure how strong that linear trend is. And to calculate that with the TI84 graphing calculator, we're going to do regression analysis. But before we do, in order for that analysis to actually calculate the value we're interested in, I need to choose a mode option. So I'm going to press mode and then go down, use the down arrow to go down to stat diagnostics. And I want to move over, use the right arrow to go over to turn that on. So I'm going to hit enter to select and to turn on the stat diagnostics. On some calculators, older calculators, you might not have this menu available to you. So let me show you how we can get to that. So let's say this is turned off, but you don't actually see anything quite like this. If you go down at the very bottom of your calculator, there's a catalog that has all the commands of your calculator essentially listed there. So some of them, they don't really show up other places. So let me, it's a second command, it's above the 0, so I'm going to hit second and then choose 0. And then the command that we're looking for, it's called, so this is a list of all the commands, it's called diagnostics on. So I'm going to press D. Notice that the cursor is set to the alpha setting, so the letter is going to be activated, and I'm going to press the x to the -1 key here to choose D. It's going to take me down to the D's, and then I'd like to go down to diagnostics on, or diagnostic on, and then press enter, and then enter again to actually do the command. So now if I go back to mode, I can see with this calculator, I can see that the stat diagnostics were turned on. So if you don't have that command on your calculator, that's the way to go about turning it on. Okay, so that's sort of a long story for what we'd like to do here. I'd like to conduct a regression. So once I have that turned on, I'm going to go back to the Stat menu and go over to Calc, so hit the arrow to go over to the Calc menu, and then I want to go down to option 4, Linear Regression, and choose Enter. And it identifies the lists that are going to be used in the regression. I'm going to add one more thing. We wouldn't absolutely have to do this just to get the correlation coefficient, but I'm going to store. This is saying store the regression equation. I'm going to store that in Y1 under the Y equals menu, but I don't want to hit the Y equals menu. What I'd like to do is identify Y1 by going to vars. I'm going to hit the vars key, go over to yvars, and then choose function and Y1. And that will store the output of the regression analysis in the Y equals menu as Y1. So now I'm going to hit enter. Well, I guess enter to go down to calculate, and then enter one more time. And we see the regression. They tell us, A and B, which fill in the linear regression AX plus B. But then what's important for us, we see this R value. R is the letter that represents the correlation coefficient. The R value is negative 0.957, let's say. And what else? Those values, the A and B values, they're stored now in the Y equals menu as Y1, by adding Y1 to that list. And what's great about doing it that way is that the calculator then, it doesn't do any rounding. It just puts as much information as it has, into the Y equals menu. So let's go back to the graph and see what we have. So notice that plot 1 is activated. We can see up here, plot 1 is activated. But now I'm also going to see this line added to the graph. And we can see, what happens, that line, it's kind of the best line to fit all of this data. It's the line that gets as close as it could be to as many data points as possible in sort of a technical way. This coefficient, the correlation coefficient, tells us how strong that relationship is. Values that are close to +1 would indicate a positive relationship between the data values that is close to linear. And values that are close to -1 like this, negative 0.957 is pretty close to -1, and it indicates a relationship that's negative, that as the weight goes up, the miles per gallon go down. And we can see from that correlation coefficient that the relationship is pretty close to a linear relationship. I want to point out one more thing on your calculator that you might run into. If you go to Stat, and then over to Calc, and down to Linear Regression, if I choose that option, I might not see the list 1, list 2 kind of presented for me. And so then to do what we just did, if this is the sort of command that you see, what you can do is identify list 1. List 1, of course, is down above the 1 key, the second command above 1. And then choose a comma, which is above 7. And list 2, so that it will read data from list 1 and list 2, and we could stop there, and in fact those would actually be the defaults, so we wouldn't even need to enter them. Except I'd like to, again, identify the Y1 variable as the output for the linear regression equation. So I'm going to go to vars, and then choose yvars, hit enter, and hit enter again to choose Y1 as the output value. So if you didn't have that stat wizard that kind of showed the list 1, list 2 there for you, this is what you'd want to do: list 1, comma, list 2, comma, and then Y1 or Y2 or wherever you wanted to put that function. And now if I hit enter, we see the same stuff that we did before. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.